This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. Just like the 20th century, the 19th century was a period of turmoil throughout the world, stirred by politics, conflicts, i.e. wars, greed, and let's not forget royal family nepotism. All of those elements were present between December 1861 and January 1862, when the Spanish, British, and French navies all weighed anchor at the Mexican port city of Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico was undergoing a tumultuous stage in its history as various groups fought, literally, to forge the country's identity. Parachuted into that boiling cauldron several years later were two young, idealistic, and unique European royals, recruited by the French Emperor Napoleon III, strictly for his own interests. Austrian Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian von Habsburg and his young wife, Prince Charlotte of Belgium, or better known as Carlota, neither of whom had ever been to Mexico, were crowned as Emperor and Empress of the struggling nation. Only 2 short years later, Maximilian had been executed by Mexican firing squad, and Carlota was back in Europe, entering a period of 48 years of mental deterioration. What led to this troublesome stage of Mexican history and tragic ending for this young, optimistic European couple? Here to help explain this largely unknown historical episode is M.M. McAllen, Director of Humanities at the Witt Museum in San Antonio, former adjunct professor at the University of Texas, also in San Antonio, and author of Maximilian and Carlota, Europe's Last Empire in Mexico. Hello, M.M. Thanks very much for being here today.
I'm very happy to be here.
So, M.M., the dynamics taking place during this period of history in both Europe and North America were really complex. Can you give us a brief overview of what was happening in those regions that led to this remarkable situation?
Well, one thing I like to say is that even though it was in our time of civil war during this period, there were worldwide conflagrations going on. So sometimes I like to think of it as actually our First World War, if you will, because there were cause and effects all around the globe. For instance, France had gone on to occupy other countries, the Crimea, parts of China, and they had their eyes set on Japan as well. They were bent on sort of a world domination, if you will, to, in quote, raise up society and sophisticate it. At the same time, Otto von Bismarck in Germany had his eyes set on consolidating all the German states, which was a threat to the Habsburg Empire, which had been the largest in the world at one time. So France was also a protectorate of Rome and as the temporal home of the Vatican. So they were fighting against Habsburg interests and against Italians. So there were lots of things going on just besides our Civil War. And so if you also look at Spain, they had taken over Cuba. The Habsburgs were running Brazil. So there were lots of colonial outreaches going on at that time, or sort of a shoring up of the desperate states that were in Europe. So it was a time of conflict for sure.
And Mexico, in a sense, was desperate as well as it tried to establish some sort of identity.
Exactly. What happened after independence from Spain in 1821? They had suffered about 54 presidencies in 30 years. And monarchists people who had been devoted to the monarchy prior to 1821 still floated around in Mexico. And then many of them lived as expats in Europe. And they began to call Mexico a failed state because of the unrest that had gone on over all those years. And then finally, when Benito Juarez and his cadre were elected, they were from Oaxaca, they were intellectuals. They immediately decided to nationalize the properties of the Catholic Church in Mexico. In fact, the Sebastian Lerdo de Tejada, who was on Juarez's team, estimated that the church owned over 3 billion pesos in land given to them over the years. That and just keep in mind, a peso was equivalent to $1. They were equal in the time. So you're looking at $3 billion worth of property in that day. So what that translates to is about 20 times that in today's dollars. And as you know, Mexico was rich with natural resources. And so the British were in there in a very big way, wanted to have their mines, railroads, and what have you. And Spain also wanted to have more interests in Mexico, and then, of course, France. And at the time, in Europe, Europe was going through industrial revolution, if you will. Cotton had become vastly important to Europe. The mills were thriving. The mills also fueled almost the entire economy. What was good for the mills was good for the watchmaker, or what was good for the mills was also good for people who provided foodstuffs. I mean, so things were bustling along. The only problem with France is that they were beginning to have a silver crisis, and so thusly, and so they couldn't buy cotton from India, which would only accept coinage in silver. So they set their sights on Mexico for those reasons. Plus, there was sort of a competition with these big countries. France had the largest, most powerful military system in the world in the day, and they wanted to flex their might. And so with Juarez coming in, the monarchists in Mexico fired up again. The monarchists were also very devout Catholics. So when Juarez was seizing the Catholic lands, mostly because Mexico didn't have much of a treasury, and how they could sustain their government was by selling land or leasing it out. So there was, the monarchists really started pushing when Juarez started taking away the Catholic lands, and the church joined with them. So the church, very powerful, much more powerful than it was in Europe, started lobbying as well. And the two combined, the monarchists oftentimes were extremely wealthy and very influential as landowners themselves, started pressing on European royalty to come and back and run Mexico. That's what made sense to them. And so under the auspices of bond debt, they started figuring out a way to press on Mexico, if you will.
Now, Juarez was running into some of his own problems as he was trying to establish a republic, and was running into some war debt with those major European powers. So that was another factor. Right.
When the Republicans were fighting for a position in Mexico, the monarchists had taken out a great deal of bond debt, especially from France. And Miguel Miramon was the main one who entered into this bond debt. He raided the embassy offices and took cash, and then they took out a giant bond debt to defend themselves from Juarez. And then when Juarez was ultimately elected and Miramon became a general in the imperialist army, Juarez was left with that bond debt, even though he didn't enter into it. So under that pretext, the European countries decided to, with all of the pressing, Napoleon III was getting excited about maybe reinvading Mexico, because the United States was otherwise occupied in its civil war. And even though Mexico wouldn't maybe have admitted that, it depended on the United States a bit for for security of North America, if you will. But Lincoln could do nothing, and was powerless during the Civil War. So what happened is then, by the monarchists pressing on not only Napoleon III, but his wife, Eugenie, she was a devout Catholic too. All of them convinced them that Mexico is ripe for the taking, and it would just take, maybe 3 months to dominate the country from shore to shore. So they launched what one author called a friendly bondholders war, which would result in sanctions today. But then, back then, you would launch a flotilla and bomb the country. So that's what they did. And in a kind of a triple alliance, the France, England, and Spain all landed. Spain came from Cuba, and the Europeans, the French and English, came from Europe, or their shores, and started and landed at Veracruz and began a bombardment campaign, and using about half of the French military to do that at first. So anyway, while that was going on, Napoleon, meanwhile, was looking for a good Catholic monarch who might be suitable to place in position once they had softened up in the country, and he called it subduing them and occupying the country. So all of that was going on in 1861 and 62.
So eventually, Maximilian was the one who was chosen. What was behind that choice? Why was he the one?
Well, Maximilian was an archduke in the Habsburg dynasty, and his brother Franz Joseph ran Austria, or ran the empire, if you will. And in the day, they held Lombardy and the Vienna area. And the French, at one point, Maximilian became admiral of the Navy. Austria doesn't have a navy today that I know of, maybe because they're landlocked. But in the day, they were not. And so when Vienna was being attacked and Lombardy, Maximilian did not deploy an adequate amount of boats, and refused to send them, was very fearful of the giant French navy. And so thereby he lost his position. His brother fired him as the minister of those territories. So Maximilian, he had married sometime earlier Charlotte of Belgium. She was the first princess of Belgium. She was very attached to her father, Leopold I, had learned a lot about statesmanship and diplomacy through him. And he actually had rearranged Belgium as the first king from the bottom to the top, the educational system, political system, the cities, the towns, just the way the whole country operated. So she learned this sort of at his side, and she had married Maximilian, and I think she was a bit disappointed to have been fired like that. And so they retired. They had been buying land in the northern Adriatic, right on the coast of what today is between it's kind of above the Dalmatian coast, and in Trieste, Italy. And they built began building a very beautiful castle. And so that's all. But at the same time, I think they both, and this was not uncommon, they both wanted a position of rulership somewhere. And it was not uncommon for countries to reach out to royals who were preordained, if you will, to come and run their country, whether they were from that country or not. So a Habsburg was running Brazil, if you will. So it was not unheard of. So they got wind that Napoleon III and Eugenie got wind that Maximilian was sort of looking around, and that's how that came to be.
Now, they were somewhat unique. If you look at some of the other characters that were royals during that period, they seem to be more progressive and more knowledgeable. What were their backgrounds that made them a little different than some of the other strange royals that we saw in that era?
Well, Maximilian's brother Franz Josef had learned under the Radetzky regime of being very severe on the people. Now, Maximilian didn't feel that way. He was somewhat of a pacifist, if you will, and he was very, very interested in botany, biology, and he had taken a tour through Brazil where they were helping they were giving taxonomic names to plants and animals, and he was very fond of bugs and reptiles, and really was a naturalist, if you will. So he was very much an intellectual. He was always questioning things, enjoying nature, and loved to ride horses, and so did Charlotte. She was a very good rider herself. And they had sort of a naive elegance about them that was, very compelling to people. But by the same turn, they enjoyed the frivolities of royal living, if you will, the elegance. But they both really enjoyed. Charlotte especially enjoyed the business of state, and she actually worked sort of as Maximilian's secretary, just because that's about as far as she could go in her day. But she enjoyed that statehood very much, and they both spoke a number of different languages. They could converse with in French and in Hungarian, and they quickly, once they got the idea about Mexico, started learning Spanish much better. So they were very, very intelligent people, but just lived in a very ordered state, if you will, and expected the world to have order. And boy, were they taken off guard there.
So they accepted that responsibility to go over in Mexico, to go to Mexico. It was a bit of a mission on their part. What was the acceptance by the people of Mexico when they finally arrived?
Well, let me back up a little bit and just say that Maximilian was smart enough to know that perhaps Napoleon was sort of setting up something. So when the Mexican monarchists approached him at Trieste, Miramare, and said, "Will you please run our country?" He said, "Well, first you go back to Mexico and collect votes. A plebiscite is what it was called. And you get enough votes to show that the people really want me." So they tasked the military with going into the towns of Mexico. And even if the people couldn't read or write, they could mark their name with an X and vote. And of course, they didn't have an option really not to vote for Maximilian. Yes, we want a monarchy. So a year later, they come back and they say, "We've got the plebiscite and you're in." So they made their plans to sail. And they took two ships, and one with most of the royal entourage, and they took their own carriages made in Italy. They took horses, all sorts of goods, and they sailed from Trieste to Veracruz. When they arrived in Veracruz, part of the problem with the French military and all the militaries that were there is that they'd been suffering for over a year with yellow fever. So Veracruz in the summer was very prone to yellow fever carried by mosquitoes. They called it the vomito prieto, the black vomit. And it affected the soldiers, killed them in droves. So, and even the the Mexicans who were from the highlands wouldn't come down because they would get the yellow fever. Once you got it, then you were somewhat immune. But and that's why eventually the French brought in. They brought in about soldiers from about 40 different countries, but they also brought in from the Egyptian Khedives, provided Arab soldiers for them to put there in Veracruz because because of sickle cell issues, were somewhat immune to that and immune to malaria, or somewhat. And so when Maximilian pulls in the summer of 62, of 63, they sit there and nobody arrives. Nobody's there to greet them. It's silence. It's because the Mexican monarchist welcoming team was staying up in the highlands away from the mosquitoes. So it took them about a good part of the day to come down from the mountains and to greet them. And so they left their ship at about 4 a.m. and came through Veracruz. And to no very small fanfare. It was a few fireworks here and there and a few cheering groups. But other than that, they immediately started going upland toward Orizaba. And one of Charlotte's ladies in waiting called it haunting, that there was nobody there really to greet them.
So part of the French troops had amassed there. Was that for occupation as well of Mexico?
Yes, and they used two forces: the counter guerrillas, which were a very deadly group of guys who would ride through the lands and terrorize the people, and then it would be followed by the formal French columns after that. And they did manage by 1963 to occupy all of the country pretty much, except portions of the Sierra Madre, which you couldn't get to, but all the ports were occupied, which was important. And so General Achille Bessin, who was the head of the French military, declared that the country was subdued and ready for total occupation. But of course, what Maximilian didn't know, and we know now, is that the country was occupied only to the extent that the French bayonets could protect them. And so once the military would disappear from the towns, the Republicans would come back in. So it was, and the counter guerrillas stooped to very low methods to terrorize the people and to keep them in turmoil. So Charles Dupin was the head of that group, and he would dress in a big sombrero and a French coat and big yellow boots and with a big cigar. And his ragtag group of people, they were very, very brutal fighters. And the Republicans in Mexico tried to answer that violence with more violence. So so Maximilian traveled in a very protected way to Mexico City, but there he was sort of trapped, if you will, couldn't really leave.
So did he have the success that he had been optimistically looking for, and that Napoleon as well had been expecting? What was the outcome of his reign in Mexico?
Well, one of the first things he did, like Charlotte said, this country has to be reordered in every way from bottom to top. And she couldn't understand how come in the cities it was mostly European-based settlers, criollos as they were called, and in the country it was mostly Native Americans. And she couldn't understand why there was such a disparity. But Mexico was made up of so many indigenous groups and so many cultures that they had never totally been unified as one country. There were different languages, different mores, different cultural things. So and then Maximilian said, well, the first thing we must do to get these people educated in a whole systematic society is get the church out of the schools. And when he arrived, the monarchists and the church expected him to turn over all of the lands that Benito Juarez had seized. Part of the problem with that was that Juarez had already sold quite a number of the properties, and they had been sold again and sold again. And there was really almost no way to restore those properties to the monarchists and the church. And he didn't agree with it anyway. He said, the church is too powerful here, and we've got to get them in their right place. And so almost immediately he made enemies with the church. The monarchists hung on and still supported him because they were back in control again in many ways. So, they would come to the big balls at Chapultepec Palace, where Maximilian ended up living, and which was a beautiful palace, still there. It sits on top of a basalt ridge that it had been established by a silver magnate in the colonial times. And so he lived up there. Charlotte loved it up there because they didn't want to stay in the National Palace. It was too messed up. And so, but they would have these big balls, and at night they could hear the cannons firing against the Republican armies who were at the gates of Mexico City. And so they were sort of trapped, but the monarchists hung on. They loved that lifestyle, the parties, the galas, the balls, just the whole thing. Maximilian would distribute gold-covered cigars. They drank lots of brandy, lived a very high lifestyle, if you will. And every morning Maximilian would go out and go riding with Charlotte and devised different ways to what they, in quote, civilize the city. They wanted to do a big paseo, a big street, which exists to this day, lay out the town, drain the lakes. They were surrounded by lakes, and modernize, bring electricity to the city, bring all sorts of what they called European modern things to the city. And so they tried as best they could, but when the policy was laid down that the lands were not going to get returned, things continued to deteriorate. So Maximilian was losing his support.
So all of that lifestyle was a bit of an illusion, because all through that time they were losing the war to the Republicans, and eventually that led to the downfall. And Napoleon pulled out his troops eventually, didn't he?
Yes, well, what was happening, like I mentioned, German unification, all of those measures were knocking on France's door. And and Napoleon just kept sending troops. And in fact, the majority of the French army was in Mexico at some point. So he knew he had to probably recall. Plus, he was losing money. He wasn't getting what he needed out of Mexico. He wanted to get silver. He wanted to get all the assets he could. They were getting cotton, which was being shipped as contraband from Texas through Mexico out to Europe. But Napoleon III just wrote to Maximilian and said, I have to close my account with Mexico, and I'm going to recall the troops. And he had promised prior to that he would never desert Maximilian. And so Charlotte was completely undone by that. And so, and Maximilian tried what he could to organize his own army, and he kept failing. He couldn't do it. He didn't know how. He didn't have the support. His closest advisors were even telling him, this has all been a bubble. And but he determined that he would try. But when it became evident that Napoleon was going to withdraw everything, and he told Maximilian, there's not another sou for you, he sort of primed and trained Charlotte on a mission to go back to Europe to on a diplomatic case to argue their case for Mexico.
And while she was doing that, eventually Maximilian was captured at the hands of the Republicans. And as I read in your book, it was because of the betrayal of one of Maximilian's Mexican officers and a bodyguard.
Right. This man, his name was Lopez, and Maximilian was godfather to his children, but the writing was sort of on the wall, and Maximilian had planned to abdicate. He sent Charlotte to Europe. He made plans to abdicate, and he moved to Orizaba for a while. And all the monarchists piled in on him. These monarchists were very worried about what was going to happen to them if the Republicans won. They were afraid of being shot or tortured or what have you. So they came in to him at Orizaba and still at Mexico City, and they said, "You can't leave. You can't leave us like this. We need you. You still have a chance." And so he had packed up a good part of his goods. They were already at Veracruz being loaded on the original ships that he had come in on to begin with. And Charlotte was in Europe by then. She went straight to Saint Cloud, to the palace. It's a palace that no longer exists there in France, to see Napoleon III. So, he didn't really know what to do. Once she left, he really didn't know what to do. I mean, his leadership skills failed him. His health was failing him. And he capitulated, and he decided to, instead of going back to Mexico City, he decided to go to Querétaro, which was a frontline bulwark against, they really felt like at the end of our Civil War that the Confederates or the United States in general was going to invade Mexico and take over Mexico. So they put Querétaro as a sort of, they fortified it. They supplied it for in case such an invasion ever occurred. And in fact, the American government, once the Civil War was over, like Phil Sheridan said, he said, "I believe the Civil War will never be over until the French are out of Mexico." And so Ulysses Grant sent him to the border to fortify the Republicans. And in fact, a lot of decommissioned Union officers went on in to help the Republican Army and revive it very successfully.
So the Republicans, despite some plans for Maximilian to escape, Republicans did capture him. He and two of his generals were sentenced to death after a court-martial. Can you describe that execution scene?
Yeah, there was an official photographer who had been with the military taking pictures along the way. He was actually, I think, Belgian, and he was not allowed. What happened is eventually at Querétaro, after weeks of bombardment, and Querétaro was a very strong town and had many churches, and the church, the nuns were supporting Maximilian, baking his bread and helping him to just survive. They were taking lead off of the roofs of the churches to mold bullets. They were getting really desperate. And then the Republicans had enough numbers where they cut off the water supply to the town. So things went from bad to worse, and he was betrayed. He was held up, in one of the churches, betrayed, and he tried to ride away, and the Republicans caught him and imprisoned him. And so both his generals, Tomás Mejía and Miguel Miramón, were tried in the what is today known as the Teatro Juárez. It's a theater. And Maximilian didn't come. He was being attended to by his doctor, Samuel Bosch, who he had very bad dysentery. He was very ill and weak. and didn't attend. He said it was a kangaroo court. Anyway, he did have a lawyer represent him. No, 3 lawyers actually. One was American, and they convicted him. And they had to hang around for about a month until the end.
He was quite stoic until the end, as he was standing in front of the firing squad. Describe that scene for us.
Well, he knew that the end was coming, and everybody was flying to Zacatecas or wherever Juarez was in the day. He was kind of moving around, but he said, and he actually was allowed people to appeal for the life of Maximilian. And a number of women especially went to Juarez and said, you can't kill him. We don't even have a death sentence program. We don't have a death penalty in Mexico. And Europeans were writing to Juarez saying, you can't do this. And Juarez steadfastly refused, basically saying, if I don't kill him, the people will fall upon me. And I think what he really wanted to do was send a message to Europe of no more occupation, do not mess with Mexico anymore. So the morning of the execution, the firing squad is lining up, and Maximilian arrives in his carriage. And he gives a centenario, which is a big gold coin, to each member of the firing squad, telling them, don't fire at my face. Don't hit me in the face. I want my mother to recognize me when I get back to Austria. And so they line up, and Maximilian's in the middle. And Maximilian says, no, the place of honor belongs to Miramon. So he puts him in the middle. And so the court photographer was not allowed to take a picture of the execution. So he quickly sketches a drawing so you can see Maximilian. And recently, a couple of years ago, I went back to Austria and met with the museum that has Maximilian's suit that he was executed in. And what we found is that the bullets came through his vest and out the back of his coat that he had. And what we know now is that instead of just standing there, he pulled his coat apart and put his hands on his hips, and so took the bullets that way. That didn't make it into the book because I didn't find that out until a couple of years ago. But he took it, on face first, and refused a blindfold.
So that the execution, though, is not quite the end of the story for that couple, is it? Because Carlota, for her part, went on to try to persuade Europe to provide support, including speaking to the Pope.
Right. So she's sent by Maximilian with a plan, saying to Napoleon III, saying, you promised us you would never leave us. And so she goes to Saint Cloud and she meets with Eugenie. And Eugenie tells her that Napoleon is too sick to see anybody. In fact, he had bladder stones. And she said, I don't care. I'm going to just walk in his room. I'm not going to leave until I see him. And so she had a couple of meetings with him and said, you promised us, and she even gathered the bankers of France to say, we need more bond funds. We can do bond exchanges with you. We will do anything to get you to stay and provide us other troops or whatever was needed. And after an exhausting week of negotiations, she finally met with Napoleon one more time, and she said it was all slime from beginning to end. And she told him, we will never think well of you again. We will just abdicate. And Napoleon finally just said, abdicate. And that was the end of it. And so she went to go see Miramare, their castle, and all the progress that had been made to finish it in their absence. And she was very pleased with that. And her supporters started coming around, her family and friends. And she got word that she needed to go to Rome with some of Maximilian's staff members to talk to the Pope to see if the Pope, because Napoleon III was still protecting the Vatican. So they were hoping that Pius IX, who was one of the most conservative popes ever, pretty much in the history of the church, would come and tell Napoleon, you must go back to Mexico. So she goes to Rome. She checked in at the Alberch Roma, and she makes plans to go see the Pope. And she saw him, and he sort of demurred. He didn't know exactly what to do. She goes to see him again, and she refuses. She was acting kind of paranoid, and she asked, before she went to go see him a second time, she asked if she could go to mass with him, and he refused that too. And she was starting to get more and more paranoid. She said, everybody behind the pillars in the chapel of the Vatican will be wanting to kill me, and she thought she was going to be poisoned. And she waits for another audience with the Pope, and she gets a return visit from him. But meanwhile, she starts doing odd things like going to the Trevi fountain and filling her water jug by herself, with her maids. She orders her maids to bring chickens to her room and tie them to the legs of the piano so she could see the chickens killed and cooked. She brought in a little brazier, and she peeled her own oranges. She, cracked her own nuts. She was very, very afraid of being poisoned. She, in the middle of the night, decides to go to the Vatican, demands to see the Pope, and is let in. And she won't leave. She said, I'm not going to leave here. And she was very hungry. She went into the kitchen of the Vatican and stuck her hand in boiling stew and burned herself. She was a complete wreck. She was shaking. She was pale. And interestingly, Pius IX, who suffered from epilepsy, said, of all the trials I've faced in all my years, a woman has had to go crazy in the Vatican. So they sort of distracted her, and then sent her back to the hotel, where then she was met by her brother, who had come in from Brussels, and he picked her up and took her back to Belgium. And that's pretty much, she was exhibiting very strange behavior there. She was a genius woman who just was suffering from this horrible paranoia. And, there's sometimes, I think, a fine line between genius and madness. And she was living with her brother, but she would do things like walk around without any clothes on her and do very strange things. So, and he had young children. So he sent her to another palace called Buchholz, and that's actually where she spent the rest of her life. She died after World War I was over.
So she was never really successful in convincing anybody in Europe. And so was that basically the end of her involvement with Mexico once she was sent to Buchholz and lived out her life then?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, people would come try to visit her. But she didn't see anybody. Luis Blasio, who was Maximilian's secretary, who was very close with her, was not able to get in to see her. He could see her walking around the grounds, but that's about as close as he could get. And otherwise, she was a novelty within the Habsburg family. They'd talk about crazy Carlota and all that. But she continued to play the piano, and she wrote letters, but she would do very impulsive, strange things. And so that was pretty much the end of her realm. It was just 3 years, but it changed her life, and it changed, more importantly, I think it changed Mexico forever in many ways. Ironically, after Juarez died, Porfirio Diaz took over, but while Juarez was alive, I think the Mexicans really felt, for the first time, a complete sense of unity and identity, like no more interference. It was a tough time.
And that's a portion of history that doesn't receive a lot of exposure, that Mexico trying to establish its identity through those several hundred years following independence from Spain.
Right. There's a whole body of controversy around Porfirio Diaz, who ruled the country for 30 years. But I have to say, Juarez re-embraced the country and pretty much obliterated every sign that Maximilian had ever been there, just tried to he reestablished relationships with the United States and trade and what have you. So he didn't live much longer, but after that time. But I do think that it changed Mexico for in many ways forever, and not only just the psyche of the people, but the food, the music, the traditions that Mexico celebrates today. Cinco de Mayo was part of that, and so there was sort of a pride about those sorts of things, and rising to become what they felt was more of a world power than they had been before. And so it was a very, very strange time. I mean, who would imagine an Austrian running Mexico and having it full of Belgians and Hungarians and Crimeans and Egyptians and all sorts of people. But it did something, I think, for the country in a positive way, ultimately. And very sadly, Maximilian gave his life for that, and which shocked the world. Napoleon III died not that long after himself. Europe was pretty changed as well. So it was, and in fact, Franz Joseph, who had discouraged Maximilian to abdicate and said, "You can't come back to Austria and get your old pay and your old rank," finally invited him back to Austria, and the letter was received the day after Maximilian was shot on June 19th, 1867. So, and it was received by Washington and then wired they tried to wire it to Maximilian. And Maximilian himself wanted, I think he did want to abdicate, but he was told by his mother, a Habsburg doesn't leave their station, their throne. And so I think at his mother's argument, that was part of it. It was duty,
Well, I suppose an appropriate but tragic ending to somebody of his stature. And your book really was an epic read. So we thank you, for leading us through this extraordinary stage in Mexico's history, and for telling us the story of these two unique individuals. We appreciate that, MM.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in today. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.